this legislation. Thank you.
Dr. Megan Woods.
Thank you, and I'm very happy to take a call on this bill and continue the case of why it is that Labor is opposing this legislation. We've got very clear reasons why we are opposing this bill that has come before the House. We're opposing it because it's a politicised attack on local government and it will undermine democratic processes and put a fiscal squeeze on councils. We see this as yet another attack on democracy. Not content with stealing votes in Canterbury and their machinations in Auckland, this is a government that is going after more democratic rights in this country. The raiders continue. And this is a solution looking for a problem in this Act. It's a reform to a manufactured crisis based on manufactured statistics. We've heard members in this House tonight, we heard Nick Smith before the dinner break, and we've just heard Nikki Kay continuing this myth-making, spinning the numbers, even though their own officials don't agree with them. We've had DIA tell the national government that this isn't right. The regulatory impact statement for this bill raises issues as to risks as to whether the proposals will work, the significant sector reaction that is likely, and the assumptions that have not been partially tested. The numbers used in this this is modelled on are shonky. We heard the previous member from the government side talking about the need for greater transparency in budgeting in local government. Well, I would put it to members here that actually the levels of transparency that we have around budgeting in local government far outstrip the levels of transparency we have at central government. The debt equity ratios that territorial and local authorities need to work to are transparently paid out not only in long-term council community plans but also in the annual planning process. There is this level of transparency, so let's not dress up what this legislation is really about. And what this legislation is really about is yet another raid on New Zealanders' democratic rights and their rights to be heard. And what this legislation is also about is a yet another way for this government to try and sell assets in this country. And this is the focus of the legislation that I'm going to talk about tonight. We have had it not dressed up at all by government ministers, and indeed the Prime Minister, that this is one of the primary objectives of the legislation. Provisions in this bill will enable the government to really put the fiscal squeeze on councils to sell their assets, and they're being advised by the Prime Minister and the Minister of Local Government to consider selling those assets. New Zealanders are telling this government over and over again that they are opposed to asset sales at central government level, and they are also opposed to these sales at local government level. This is not something that community wants. In January this year, Earthquake Recovery Minister Jerry Brownlee asked for a list of ratepayer-owned strategic assets in Christchurch and said there would never ever be any pressure put on Christchurch City to sell those assets. Well, you don't ask for a list of something just to keep it in your back pocket. And lo and behold, what has happened? There is continued pressure going on for the sale of assets in Christchurch. We are seeing a mayor and a council having to do a pushback to keep hold of those assets. And let me tell you, John Key has said that it's time for us to have a grown-up conversation about asset sales in Christchurch and Christchurch sittings holding on that. Well, let's start that grown-up conversation right here and now about Christchurch's assets. Let me tell you a story of a city that withstood the ideological push over a number of years and retained its assets. A city that was branded, which the Business Roundtable at the time thought was going to be a put-down, was branded as the People's Republic of Christchurch. Well, I can tell members opposite that actually, and this should be a bit of a warning bell before you start trying to flog off our assets in Christchurch, that was a tag we wore with pride. We did not sell our assets, and in fact, we did everything we could to keep them. And what does this city that managed to keep intact its asset base, what does this story have to teach the nation? Well, this is a city that has an asset base of around $2.3 billion, plus, additionally, its city housing stock, of which it's the second largest landlord in New Zealand. We have assets like our electricity supply company, Orion. We have our shareholding, we have our airport, our ports, our city care, Redbus, and the list goes on. And these assets, these cumulative assets that have been built up by generations of Christchurch people, what has the impact of retaining these assets been? Well, the impact has been that Christchurch has rates that are on average 20% lower than the rest of the country. So we are being told by the government that one of the purposes of this bill is that they want to reduce the burden of rates on residents around New Zealand. Well, here's a salient lesson through the story of my city, the story of Christchurch. Don't flog off your assets and you get a dividend stream. That dividend stream to Christchurch is what has kept our rates low. Because how have we kept our rates low? Has it been by slashing and burning and not providing services to its residents? No, that has not been the way that we have kept rates low. It is that dividend stream for these assets that we have jealously held on to. The dividend stream of around $40 million per annum that is returned to the city. That equates to around $2 per week for the average household that they do not have to pay in rates. This is a dividend stream coming from Christchurch Sitting Holding Limiters of around $100 million per annum. So this is even a conservative take back to the city that allows for the building of the assets, and it is just at beggars belief that we might want to sell these off. So how much could these be flogged off for? Well, we don't know. Because our council that is being pressured to ready these assets for sale, and information that I've had released under the Lagoima, under the Local Government Official Information Act, because actually I've got a list, they've listed all the assets and what they're worth, and then they've been asked to put together a book value for them. Well, that's all been blanked out, so we don't know actually what the government thinks we could have. But what we do know is that they're asking them to repeat the model, their mixed ownership model, which is a fancy way of saying selling off the assets that they're doing at central government level, well, they're being asked to do that at local government level as well. What is the net result for Christchurch going to be if these assets are sold off, as this legislation is going to put the push on to do? It is going to be higher rates in the long run, because half of that $40 million a year of dividend stream is now going to be received through the rate system. Even if Christchurch City has to endure the 7.5% rates increase that the council is currently proposing in its annual plan, rates in Christchurch will still be 16% lower than the rest of the country, simply because we had the foresight as a city to hold on to our assets. And what we have now is a government that says that it wants to force councils to sell their assets in an effort to keep rates low. Well, the story of Christchurch shows how short-sighted that is. It shows the fact that actually, financially, in the long run, all it is going to do is put rates up. It's exactly the same arguments against selling our state assets at central government level. This is an ideological commitment from members opposite to put on the block assets that have been built up by generations of New Zealanders that are not theirs to sell, and they have no mandate to sell. This piece of legislation does nothing to enhance democratic rights in New Zealand. It does nothing to better local government. All it will do is asset strip the people of New Zealand in yet another way.
Maggie Barry.
Thank you, Mr Speaker. I rise happily to talk